Okay, so I'm going to lecture on the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. And these are some of the key terms that I'll be bringing up throughout the lecture. And so you don't have to write all of this down now. Just know, to keep an eye out for them because they're going to come up, and I'll talk about each one individually. We've already learned about some of the long-term causes we've having to do with U.S. expansion from east to west. We already learned about the Louisiana Purchase, the Adams-Onis Treaty, where the U.S. gets Florida, and Texas independence occurring in 1836. Next, I'll talk about Manifest Destiny and Oregon Fever. Manifest Destiny. The belief that the United States was quote unquote destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific because of its superiority. It was coined by John L. O'Sullivan in 1845. So, Manifest Destiny, that idea that the US was racially superior and that it was favored by God, and therefore it was destined that the United States was going to take over the land that was occupied by Native Americans, Spanish Americans, and Mexicans. And so it's an idea that is popular throughout the 19th century. One example of that is when James Polk was campaigning to be elected president of the United States in 1845. James Polk said that if he was elected, he would expand the United States. And part of it had to do with Oregon. So, Oregon was a territory in the Northwest that was contested. It was claimed, by this point, it was claimed by both the United States and the United Kingdom. And so the United States would encourage its citizens to move to Oregon to have a stronger claim on Oregon. In a way, it's similar to what Spain and Mexico did when they were encouraging US citizens to move to Texas to help them have a stronger claim. Only the US was encouraging its own citizens to do that. But when we see these campaign slogans, we learn that spin is not something entirely new today. Back then, he was already, and he wasn't saying to US citizens, help me have, take a stronger claim on Oregon. No, he portrayed it as if it had been taken away from us and we're the victims and we're just taking it back. So, he wasn't saying help us have a stronger claim. He was saying, help us reoccupy Oregon as if we need to take it back. And not only did he argue that Oregon belonged to the United States, he also said 54-40 or fight. What does that mean? It means that not only is Oregon ours, but it goes up to the 54-40 latitude, which is the southern border of Alaska. So not only is it ours, but there's no Canadian territory in between. Oregon goes all the way to Alaska and it's ours. Or fight. So we're claiming it to that territory, to that point, or we're going to fight for it. And then there was Texas. He also campaigned on the idea that not that we were going to annex Texas to the United States, but again, this implication that it was ours, somehow taken away from us, and we're just going to take it back. We're not the aggressors. We're just going to take it back. We're going to re-annex it. And so this succeeded. This got him elected. These campaigns of wanting to expand the United States at the expense of others, but expressed in ways where we're not the aggressors, where we're just taking, where we're the victims and we're just taking land back, is how he was elected. So he became president and it worked. Now, we learned that in 1836, Texas defeated Santa Anna and made him sign, or had him sign the Treaty of Velasco, where Santa Anna agreed to Texas independence and to leave back back south with the remainder of his army into Mexico. But when Santa Anna arrived to Mexico City, Mexican Congress told him that Treaty of Velasco is illegitimate because the Mexican general and president, which Santa Anna was both, does not have the authority to sign away Mexico's territory. And so Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas. Yeah. Then there's also a last minute effort to try to buy, for the US to buy the Southwest, what they called California, New Mexico, for $25 million. They sent a person by the name of John Slidell to Mexico City to make this offer. It's referred to as the Slidell Mission, and Mexico turned it down. They said, no thanks. So before the war begins, the United States offers Mexico $25 million for the Southwest. So President Polk default microphone, change to microphone hover cam. All right, we'll check what happens with that. All right, so Polk gets elected. Tyler actually annexes Texas before Polk is inaugurated. Mexico breaks off diplomatic relations with the United States, and it's a very common thing that happens right before war erupts. They're saying, we've tried to resolve these issues diplomatically. We have not been successful. We're pulling our diplomats out. And so then both countries send armies to the border. However, the border was in dispute. Texas says that their southern border is the Rio Grande. Mexico says that the southern border of Texas is the Nueces River. Nueces. Now, if you look at a map, the section between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River is not a lot. It's not a big difference. But the implications are huge if you continue following the Rio Grande, all the way to New Mexico. And so, it more than doubles the size of Texas if you go with the Rio Grande, even though the space between the two rivers is not that much. So yeah, they disagree on what the border is. Both countries send armies into the disputed territory. Now, back then, we would follow the US Constitution that says that only Congress can declare war. And so President Polk goes to Congress and tells them that American blood has been shed on American soil so that Congress would vote for war and then we could go to war. The thing is that he didn't tell them that it was in disputed territory. And he also didn't yet have confirmation of fighting happening. He didn't know that American blood had been shed on anywhere. But he sent the US Army with that goal. So he knew it was going to happen. And so even though he didn't have any confirmation of it happening, he knew it would happen because that's what he sent the army to do. And so Congress votes in favor of it, although not without some hesitation and some protests. First is the Wilmot Proviso that said that, okay, we just annexed Texas as a slave state. So any additional territory that is gained from this war will not be open to slavery. But that also demonstrates that from the very beginning, this wasn't about the disputed territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, because they were already plotting what to do with the land they were going to get as a result of this war. And then there was some protest. Abraham Lincoln did what is referred to as the spot resolution, where he tries to call Polk on his bluff and say, okay, you say that American blood has been shed on American soil. Show me the spot where that happened. And he didn't know because he didn't know where it happened. He just knew he sent his army into disputed territory for that to happen. But he didn't know where it ended up happening, where the two armies ended up meeting. So the war begins. It's sometimes referred to as a three-prong approach, where you have part of the kind of the Navy and Marines hopping along the coast, making their way to Veracruz, the same place that Cortez had gone to make his way to Mexico City. Then there is coming down the center, right down the middle, inland into Mexico. And then there's also going straight to New Mexico and California to the west to claim that land. So it was, it was right away focused on going into the interior of Mexico and claiming the Southwest. So some of the earlier battles happened closer to the border, like in Monterrey, just south of the Rio Grande, up here in kind of like Texas, New Mexico, up here in California, and then, they worked their way south. In that, one of those earlier battles in Monterrey, I'll introduce you to one woman in particular who played a role in the Mexican-American War. Now it is very common, how do I put it? It's common for us to think of wars just being men, but it's also common, just not historically recognized, that women play roles as nurses, women try to stay close to their family. And then there's examples of women playing other roles like spies or informants or journalists or even combatants. And so here's one story of one individual in Mexico. We'll just go with her short version of her name, Josefa Zozaya, although apparently she had 2 first names, 2 middle names, 2 last names, and then her married name. But we'll just go with Josefa Zozaya for short. So she lived in the city of Monterrey, and in September of 1846, when most of the population of the city was evacuating because the US Army was approaching, she instead took the decision to stay. She was there with her 2 daughters. And then she offered her house to the Mexican, because this is also one of the earliest urban battles, some say in history. And so, you know, urban warfare is a little different. And so, yeah, she decided to stay in the city, and she offered her house to the Mexican army because it was at a strategic location. And so, yeah, they ended up turning it into a fortified building. She provided food and ammunition to the Mexican army. And that was very important, at least for the Mexican soldiers that were closest to her, because one of the reasons the Mexican army gives for why they lost the battles they did is that they weren't very well supplied. They didn't have a lot of ammunition for these battles. And so the fact that she had some helped at least the soldiers that were there in her building, be able to fight off longer. She also took up arms herself, took a rifle and started shooting from her rooftop along with civilians and soldiers. And once the battle was over, she withdrew together with the soldiers, not before the battle. It was a battle that lasted 3 days. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the efforts of women, get lost through history. But, this is one where at least we know one person who's, we know a little bit about her story, actual picture of her. There's been plays made about her. That's where this image comes in. This newer one is from the plays that were written about her. Well, where she's a character in those plays. There's a couple plays that were made right after the Mexican-American War that include her and recognize her for her role. Yes.
So with like the last map where it was showing some of the early battles,
Yeah.
what was necessarily the point of like having battles within undisputed territory? Were they just trying to kind of like cripple the Mexican army, or?
Yeah. So why was the U.S. fighting battles here? I think it was to claim the territory. I think it was to defeat the Mexican army. But ultimately, going all the way to Mexico City, I think it was to avoid Mexico's claim from the Texas-Mexican War. In the Texas-Mexican War, Mexico said, well, only Congress can sign away Mexico's territory, not the president. So this time they're like, okay, we're going to go all the way to Mexico City and make Congress sign the document. And so that Mexico wouldn't have that legal, I don't know, contestation or complaint afterwards. That'd be my theory. Yeah. All right, then I'll introduce you to the San Patricio Battalion. All right, so the middle of the 19th century, the 1840s, also coincided with the potato famine in Ireland that led to a wave of Irish immigration to the United States. When the Irish would arrive to the United States, they were often not very well welcomed. They were discriminated against for being Irish. and for being Catholic. When they'd arrived to the East Coast, they would find that there wasn't a lot of opportunity. There was a lot of, there must be a better word. I'm thinking of congestion, just, people living a high population density, not a lot of available housing, and they were very distrusted and discriminated against. I'll talk more about the discrimination of the Irish later when I talk about immigration. But I introduce it now because it's relevant here. One of the reasons the Irish were distrusted is that being Catholic, a lot of people in the United States thought that if they were Catholic, that meant that they followed whatever the Pope told them to do, and therefore they might be more loyal to the Pope than they would be to the United States. They were also seen as being, they were not, today we think of Irish people as white. Back then they were not seen as white. I'll talk more about that later, but it's not until 100 years later, until the mid 20th century, that Irish people get accepted as white. And that also connects to class from day one and the social construction of race. Now, there is contested history with regard, but first I'll tell you about them, and then I'll talk a little bit more about that contested history. So one of the ways that Irish people tried to demonstrate, to look for opportunity and to demonstrate their loyalty to the United States, they enlisted in the US Army. But when the Mexican-American War began, or the Mexican-American War in general, was actually the US war with the highest desertion rate. So more US soldiers deserted the US Army during this Mexican-American War than any war the US has ever had. And so there was a high desertion rate in general. But there were some Irish people in the US Army who not only deserted the US Army, but then switched sides. They joined the Mexican Army instead and fought against the United States. That is what the San Patricio Battalion is. Now, this has been, historians have written about this with their own bias, right? So US historians, eventually when the US recognized that this really happened, and I'll talk about that in a bit, US historians wrote about them as, yeah, this happened, but it happened because they were mercenaries. Mexico offered to pay them more, and that's why they switched sides so that they could make more money with the Mexican Army than with the US Army. Yeah, and then from the Mexican historians, they never denied it. They always talked about them and have memorials for them and plaques and busts and statues and all that. From the Mexican point of view, they would say that the reason they switched sides is A, because they were discriminated against in the US, B, because they were Catholic and they were defending the Catholic country, C, because they could also relate to Mexicans in the sense that England had, in a way, colonized Ireland, and the English discriminated against the Irish for being Catholic and for not being Protestant. And so it was easy for the Irish people to see the similarity between what the United States was doing to Mexico and what England had done to Ireland. All right, so, and the San Patricio Battalion was not exclusively Irish. There were people of other nationalities and backgrounds who did the same, but they were led by an Irishman and the majority were Irish. So people tend to think of them as an all Irish battalion, but they weren't. They weren't exclusively Irish. All right, they were led by John Riley, and they fought in the Mexican-American War. In particular, their specialty was artillery. So they would be the ones moving the cannons, pointing them, loading them, shooting them. And they fought at many battles. One of the biggest battles was towards the end, the Battle of Churubusco, close to Mexico City in 1847. There were 260 members of the San Patricio Battalion who fought. 80 of them were captured. 50 of them were executed. 15 of them were branded. What does all that mean? So 80 of them were captured. And from those captured ones, some of them were executed, some of them were whipped, some of them were branded, punished in different ways. John Riley, for example, was one who was not executed, and that's because he had left the U.S. Army before the war officially began. And so there's a different penalty for going AWOL, for abandoning the military, whether it's in a time of war or not. And so he was punished, but he was not executed. For him, he was one of the ones who got branded. And so if you're not familiar with branding, it's what typically happens to livestock, to like horses, bulls, donkeys, etc., cows, where you put a hot iron in the fire, and then you put it on the skin, on the hide of the animal, and it permanently like tattoos them or scars them with a symbol. So in the case of these 15 people and John Riley, they got a hot iron. It had the letter D on it. They put it on one cheek, and it turns out it was backwards. So then they did it on the other cheek the right way, with a backwards D and a forward D. What else? So yeah, that was one of the last battles they fought in. The biggest one they fought in is towards the end. Now, again, from the Mexican side, they said that John, again, talking about spin, different countries, they all do it. Mexico said that, John Riley left to Mexico because it was the right thing to do, and that he was so adamant that he had done the right thing that he married a Mexican woman and decided to never return to the United States. The United States first denied the existence of the San Patricio Battalion all the way until 1915. So for like over 65 years, the United States denied that this ever happened. And once they did, and historians wrote about it, they would say, that they left to be mercenaries, and that John Riley in particular was so ashamed of what he had done that he never dared to show his face back in the United States, and that he had become a drunkard in Mexico, and that's that. And so again, same facts, different spin, and both countries do it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What stand for?
A deserter. Deserter. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry, can't hear you.
How common was this U.S. to do that?
Huh. Yeah. So, I mean, does anyone? I would think pretty recent. I mean, to desert during battle, is treason. It's a high offense. Did you have some information? Yeah.
No, not going AWOL in general. It's
Yeah.
More of a court thing. You don't get branded today, but
Yeah.
basically your life's kind of over.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be more. Yeah, but when did it stop? I mean, I think I don't know for sure. but I wouldn't be surprised, certainly up until World War I, maybe World War II, maybe more unofficially, even beyond that. Yeah, to Korea and Vietnam. Yeah. Yeah, and you would still be punished, but not like corporal punishment like this. Yeah. All right. So the US hops along the coast, making their way to Veracruz. This image is a little hard to figure out. Basically, the shaded area is the Gulf of Mexico. The light colored area is land. And here you have Veracruz. And there's two forts. Fort Santiago, Fort Concepcion, and then the city of Veracruz. So the United States, arrives in ships. They disembark and surround it, lay siege. Let's see. So here's a painting of U.S. ships attacking the forts. Here is a painting of U.S. troops landing. They landed 12,000 troops. This was the largest amphibious landing in history prior to D-Day during World War II.
Like in the world or like?
That's my understanding, yes. And then there's, laying siege. If you might recall, to lay siege is to surround it and bombard it and not allow anyone in or out, or supplies or food or water, stuff like that, in or out. So these are US paintings. And then here we have a Mexican painting where the way they recall it, it wasn't just the forts being attacked, but the whole city being attacked. And so then, a lot of civilians being attacked as well. Then what was going on in what becomes the Southwest, specifically in California? There was one more filibuster during the war. And so there were US citizens that were in California already who armed themselves after the war started, went in and took over a fort in Northern California. And they, like previous filibusters, they said, we bring you freedom and independence. We're going to be our own country and we're going to be in charge. And so they did that. They created the Bear Flag Republic. And so, similar to Texas, California sort of, they thought, became its own country. But in the case of California, it lasted less than 4 weeks. Because in less than 4 weeks, the U.S. military arrived and said, "What's this?" And they said, "Sorry," and they took down their Bear Flag Republic flag, and then they put up the U.S. flag. But till this day, that's why they have the bear in the California flag. There is, everyone always wants to win, of course. And, in armies also say, we won this, or this was a stalemate, or they say, well, we won because less people died, or we won because we had control of the battlefield afterwards, or that kind of thing. One of the least disputed battles, or I shouldn't say that. One of the battles that the U.S. most clearly lost is the Battle of San Pascual. This was when the U.S. Army first arrived to California, to Southern California. And there was no Mexican army there. but the Californios, you know, took what they had and did what they could. Californios and people in the Southwest, this is where cowboy culture comes from. And they're also the ones that taught it to white Americans. And so they had horses and they had, I forget what they call them, but they're like lances, like long spears. And so they didn't even have like rifles or muskets. They had these long spears. So what they did is they sent out a small group to get the U.S. Army to chase after them. In particular, their what do you call it? The ones, their cavalry, the ones on horses, to chase after them. They led them to a creek where other Californios were waiting at the top of that creek, and then descended on the U.S. cavalry from the top of the creek onto them with those lances and won that battle. But Mexico did lose just about every battle, either eventually, if not initially. You don't have to know Andres Pico. He was just the last. Yeah, so the Battle of San Pascual, one of the only battles the United States lost. You don't have to know Andres Pico, just interesting photo. The last governor, Mexican governor of California. The U.S. made its way to Mexico City. In Mexico City, one of the last battles was against Los Ninos Heroes, the child heroes. And this is an example of Mexican propaganda, by the way. Like I said, all countries do it. We just have to, be aware that all countries are doing it so that we can figure out what really happened on our own. And it's usually a combination of the versions of stories. So, all right. So Los Niños Héroes are the child heroes. This is a story that gets taught to Mexican school children, I think, till this day. And the story is that there was a cadet school. So in Mexico City, they have a park called Chapultepec. It's actually like double the size of Central Park. It's the largest urban park in the Americas. So in this park in Mexico City, of the park of Chapultepec, there's a castle, and it's the castle of Chapultepec. And that castle was used as cadet training, kind of like a JROTC. It's a place for young people who are interested in joining the military, get introduced to military life and training. And so when the U.S. Army arrived to Mexico City, those cadets in the castle took up arms against the U.S. Army, and they lost. And the part that gets romanticized and taught in Mexican history is not only that they fought and died, but also that there were 6 cadets in particular who, rather than allow the United States to take down their flag and replace it with the U.S. flag, they took it down themselves, and some of them, one of them, 2 of them, I don't know how many, wrapped themselves up in the flag and jumped off the side of the cliff. And so, yeah, so jump off the side of the cliff. And so, yeah, they're remembered as Los Niños Héroes, the child heroes, and this gets taught to school children. Now, why do I say that this is propaganda? Well, they weren't all children. Some of them were over what we consider adults today. Some of them were older than 18. So calling them children is a stretch. Then is also the fact that some of the people that they claim were part of the Ninos Heroes, like there's historical records that show them still alive after the war in other parts of the military, like still having a military life. So they didn't die, even though some of them didn't die, even though they claim they died. And then no one heard this story about the child heroes until the 100-year anniversary of the war. And then the president of Mexico at that time told the story of the child heroes. And the Mexican media, the journalists were like, wow, what a great story. We want to learn more. You know, where are they buried? Where, you know, are there plaques in their names? Like a week later, coincidentally, they found 6 skeletal remains off the cliff of Chapultepec Castle. And then they built a memorial, and that memorial is still there today. And so yeah, it's there's reason to believe the story is not all they made it out to be. Yeah.
So with the story, how old would these cadets be? If
I think the youngest may have been 15, 16. Yeah. But some of them were 18, 19, 21.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was envisioning like 10-year-olds running out.
Exactly. Yeah, they're not children. Yeah. Yeah, they're adolescents and young men. Yeah. All right. So the US militarily took over Mexico City, and this time had Mexican Congress sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the treaty ending the Mexican-American War in February of 1848. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the war. Now, the United States gave Mexico $15 million for the Southwest. Now, you might find different sources. Some sources say that Mexico lost 1/3 of its territory as a result of this war, and that is if you don't include Texas. Mexico lost half of its territory if you do include Texas. And so if you include, ultimately what Mexico lost between the both wars was Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. And I think so that the US could say that they didn't steal the land. They offered 25 million before the war. After the war, they gave 15 million. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 whole states, 2 partial states. So here we have a visual of the original part that was given up by Mexico to the United States. And, what kind of things did this treaty say? Obviously it said, this is the end of the war. We're going to give you $15 million in exchange for this land. But there's some other interesting ones. Articles 8 and 9 said that any Mexicans who decided to stay in what became the United States, after 1 year, they would become US citizens. And that's interesting because that also indirectly defined Mexican people as legally white in the United States. Article 10 was signed by Mexican Congress, but it was cut out by US Congress once it was sent to the US for ratification. And they removed Article 10 had provided specific protections of land, culture, and language. And the argument was that Article 10 was not necessary because by being US citizens, they were already going to have the protections that US citizens have. But as we're going to learn after the Mexican-American War, we'll see how their land, culture, and language was not protected, despite legally being US citizens. And then there's an interesting part, Article 11, having to do with Native Americans. Because Native Americans, under Mexican law, were Mexican citizens. But under US law, Native Americans were not yet US citizens. Native Americans in the United States did not automatically become US citizens until 1924. That's about 75 years later after this. So this meant that Native Americans in Mexico that became found themselves now inside the United States, had to decide whether they were going to be Mexican citizens who become US citizens, or whether they were Native Americans who were going to not become US citizens and instead petition to try to get recognized as Native Americans and get their own tribal land or reservation. So just an interesting scenario there. And by the way, even today, the Southwest has more Native American tribes than any other part of the country. And so it's an important question. Then there's the Gadsen Purchase. After the Mexican-American War, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there was an area of land that the United States bought from Mexico for an additional $10 million, intended to be a route for the Transcontinental Railroad. And so I don't know this for a fact, but it just seems very coincidental that the US offered $25 million for the Southwest. They gave $15 million for all of the Southwest. And then they had these $10 million left over that they offered for a tiny strip of land in the south of southern Arizona and part of New Mexico here. So yeah, 15 million for all the Southwest, 6 whole states and 2 partial states. And then 10 million, 2/3 of that, just for this little strip for the Transcontinental Railroad, I think it was the Southern Pacific. Let's see here.